In this presentation, I want to go deeper into some of the readings and the concepts that are in the Law and Identity Reader. I also want to make sure it's clear the connection between identity, agency, what people believe the law is, and how that relates to the Constitution, both from the point of view of the folks that wrote the Constitution from 1776 to 1802, and for the changes that occurred after the Civil War and the implementation of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, and then how folks kind of think about it today. And I'm drawing a lot upon what you all believe as kind of representative of what people believe today. The way I would start this lecture if we were in class is to talk about this idea of how many different ways can a constitution be interpreted. So this quote comes from Chief Justice John Marshall in the early 1800s, and he's trying to resolve a political issue by referring to the Constitution, but the Constitution doesn't have much to say about the particular issue that he was trying to resolve. So he goes to Article 3 and he looks at the power of the court to interpret the Constitution and to say what the Constitution is. This causes trouble if you think about it over time, because people change their minds about what they think a word means, and situations change based on who is in the room and who's kind of being included and excluded. So I want to start from the very beginning by reminding folks, if you hadn't learned this already, that the drafters, the people who wrote the United States Constitution, were from the 13 colonies that had settled from the English island, right, from the island of England. So England had its own culture, it had its own identity, it had its own religious beliefs, it had its own kind of worldview that was very different than France, very different than Germany, very different from Europe. So, very much like what's going on today with Brexit, folks at that time would not have called themselves European, they'd called themselves English. And one of those folks from northern England was this man named John Locke, who you may have heard about before, maybe not, but an English philosopher who was kind of a part of this thing called the Scottish Enlightenment, and they were thinking about, was it proper for human beings to resist authority? Was it proper for groups of people to establish their own culture, their own society, their own rules, or should they follow the Pope? Should they follow a tribal king? What does it mean to be free? What does it mean to take care of yourself? What does it mean to be autonomous if you're doing things that other people tell you to do? So this is not, a huge conversation anymore, but as Linda Metcalf writes about in a book called Law and Identity, and you have one of the readings from that, is The Quest for Legal Sovereignty. And sovereignty is the right to self-government. And so what she noticed in her research, and this has been confirmed quite often, and I think just in your own experience, if you'd never really thought about it this way in your criminal justice and your political science classes, and even classes that are not social science classes like English and whatnot, the arguments, especially when people have arguments, they tend to be around this dual tension that John Locke talked about, which was the tension between order, security, rules, right? People following the rules, enforcing the rules, and then people who want to be free. And this is freedom, liberty. And it's interesting if you start really thinking about the ideology of the United States, you start to wonder, what does freedom look like? What does that mean in my day-to-day life? What is liberty? What does it mean to, live in the land of the free? What does it mean to have choice? Versus, what does it mean to be secure? What does it mean to have order in society? And people tend to have arguments because they're on one side or the other. So in this theory of the Constitution, and this is very much what the framers of the Constitution were thinking about, was, well, let's write down explicitly the limits that government has, what they can't do and what they can do, and let's hold them accountable, the people in office, when they try to abuse their power. This is a very difficult thing to do in practical society, but if you think about it on the other point of view, I find that most people who lack power, meaning you lack a certain economic freedom, you might not have a stable job yet, you might not have a stable place to live, you might not believe that you're a very powerful person. These folks tend to view the order side of things, and they defend the state and say, well, even if there's not an explicit power given to the state, or to the president, or to the senator, or to whoever's in the government, and it's not in the Constitution, they'll say things like, it's common sense that they should be able to do these things. Well, my argument would be, it's not common sense in the English culture. It's not common sense in the history of England and what is called Anglo-Protestant culture. And so that may be true in other cultures. But that's not the cultural background of the United States Constitution. The United States Constitution had the emphasis, and I'd put it somewhere like 85 to 90%, on individual freedom. And lots of scholars throughout time have written about this, but the most famous person was a aristocrat from France named Montesquieu, who came and both to America and to England and wrote about freedom, wrote about liberty, and noticed that in America he saw freedom as the most important thing to most people. And so they were ready to fight and go to war to defend their freedom. And you hear this a lot in the rhetoric and the propaganda when we go to war. And so you got to think about, this is a deep-seated concept that goes back to the English tradition, but might not be held by everyone. So I just want to start there so you kind of have that idea. And the reason why I wanted to know that is because if you look at these answers, you'll see that it's very diverse, right? So some people have, from experience, they don't believe that the Supreme Court will protect their rights. Other people don't have any experience with it, but they want the Supreme Court to protect their rights. And then other folks are taking what's called an originalist position, saying, like Justice Antonin Scalia says, the Constitution changes from decade to decade. Now, the thing that the person forgot to put in this answer is that Justice Scalia actually disagreed with that statement. That statement is actually from Justice Ginsburg. But most folks get confused about this. They say, well, when I ask in class, what is the Constitution, people almost always talk about the 14th Amendment, or they talk about the 8th Amendment, or they talk about the First Amendment, which we'll talk about in this video. But that's not what the Constitution is. The Constitution is Article 1, Article 2, Article 3, and Article 4. The Constitution, a little bit 5 and 6. But these are really just drafting the design, the structure of the United States government in relation to the structure of the state governments. And that was a really important thing, because at this time you have to try to remember and visualize that there are 13 different governments at the time that they're drafting this super government that is supposed to bring them together to form what's called a more perfect union, or to stop them from fighting with each other, so that Virginia isn't fighting with New York, that Alabama isn't fighting with New Jersey, right? That each of the states are kind of coming together so that they can defend themselves against the French, that they can defend themselves against the Germans, that they can defend themselves against the Spanish. And that they can have a stronger economic policy, right? So they can have an economy that goes from the north to the south and expands out to the west, and they can trade with other countries. That's easier said than done, right? I mean, each of these governments is very different. The New York government looks a lot more like the London government, whereas the Boston government looks a lot more like the countryside in northern England. They're very free. They make their own rules. And then the governments in the South are very authoritarian. They're very dictatorship. They're run like corporations. The government in Virginia, for example, is run by the Virginia Company. And so it's all based in slavery, and it's all based in economic trade. So these are wildly different, and that's why you have people like John Adams and James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, Thomas Jefferson, Ben Franklin. All these guys are arguing about what the proper form of the federal government should mean because they all have different ideas about whether it should be based in freedom or whether it should be based in order. And so you kind of, if you start talking about freedom in Virginia, right, and you want to start a government based on freedom in Virginia, so well, suddenly you have to free the slaves. And then if you start talking about order in Boston, Massachusetts, you're going to have a riot. People don't want to be told what to do. That was their whole reason for coming to Massachusetts in the first place. So you have two very different kind of cultures, but they're both arguing within this like history of English liberty and English constitutions. So I wanted to start with kind of maybe a negative point of view, but to establish very firmly that, the side that wins out by 1857. So 1776 is very much about freedom. But just a few generations later, right, like the great-grandchildren of the framers of the Constitution have now switched over to the side of order. So they're less interested in freedom, and they're particularly not interested in the freedom of slaves, of low-wage workers, of women, of immigrants, and of folks that have less economic power. So this is a real transition to where the wealthy have taken, the majority, and they're using the idea of order to be more important than freedom. And so you really see this come out in this case. And this idea of power one, or the power of one people to control another, and again, remember, this is the English people, and this is very particular people within English culture. So these are large landowners who are likely to own slaves or other production methods. So in other words, they have plantations. They're just starting to get into the factory business. They're taking over resources. So they're digging for gold, right? They're digging for coal. And so they have a lot of economic power, and so they want to use that economic power to maintain their position and their privilege within this society. And again, these are the grandchildren of the framers of the Constitution. So they're not as interested in freedom from the English monarchy. They're mostly interested in economic freedom and maintaining that control over other people. So if you look at the image to the right here, this is this concept of jurisdiction, to speak law or to speak legally. And so they're acting like a government, this group of people, this English wealthy group of people. And so they're using the institution of law to enforce their control over other people. They're using the instruments of law, court decisions, lawsuits, passing legislation, to maintain their control. And then so much so that they're actually trying to control the humans in this jurisdiction by deciding who gets to be a citizen, who gets to vote, whose property, like women at this time are the property of husbands and fathers. Slaves are the property of their masters. And then this is all informing these different ideas about what law is. So at this time, right, the prevailing or majority view about law, very much like today, is the power of one people to control another. And this is a wealthy group of people from very particular parts of England, and their ideas of economic slavery being prevalent. And so I just wanted to pull out some of the language from this court case so that you see that this is not an opinion, right? This is the decision made by the majority members of the Supreme Court, and backed by the majority of the population across many states. And so at this point of view, the ideology about law is, in order to maintain order, it's not the job of the court to decide what justice is. It's so different than what we started off with Chief Justice Marshall, talking about, it is the job of the court to decide what Constitution is and what justice is. This court is saying, no. We want to maintain the order of society as it is. And then they say, this is a law and this is a view of power that is derived from the English people. Like, how strange, right? The Revolution, the Declaration of Independence is against this view of English power, but just within a few short generations, it's back to, grabbing this idea of power. So the issue that they were looking at in this particular case was a big, huge issue that would have huge repercussions today, which is, should anyone who is not of that group of people, of that English wealthy, economic slaveholding group of people, should they be counted as citizens? And this is very much like the concept of the republic, that, people can live in the United States, they can work in the United States, but they aren't going to be able to have any influence over politics. They're not going to have any influence over economic decisions. They can die for the country in war, but they shouldn't be the ones in charge. And so what the court says very clear here is that, no, you're not a citizen unless you were told that you were a citizen at the signing of the Constitution in 1802. So what they're really saying is that the people, when people talk about the people, right, we the people, according to the Supreme Court here, are the people, the English wealthy lawyers, merchants, slaveholders, and skilled craftsmen, and some large farmers, were the people that the Constitution is talking about, and no one else gets to be a part of that people. Now, again, they can be people in the sense that they're human beings, but they're not going to be people in the sense of citizens. And so the basis or their evidence for this is saying, look, they were never intended to be included. So if the founders had intended to include them, they would have written them into the Declaration. Now, this is not just about descendants of slaves. This case is very clear. This is anyone who is not in that original English group of people. So when you hear people having these arguments about immigration, about public benefits, this is what they're still arguing about. This is that who should get to constitute citizens, who should be the people. And so when folks say like white people, right, what they probably mean is this like very narrow view of a certain group of elites who have a very particular view about economic domination that come from, certain parts of England. And so, it's not a large group of people, and skin color would not be the way of determining who gets to be a part of the people. And so it's very much based in economics and money and wealth, land, right, ownership of people. And then who's had power for several generations, that's who they want to maintain the power. So I turn to one of the authors that you have in Clash of the Civilizations and Politics of Land Reform. He also wrote a book called Who Are We? And this investigates this argument of who the people are supposed to be according to the founders, and then according to important elites throughout the last 200 years. And what you'll see is that although the identities have changed in America, and largely after the 1860s. So if you put this in context, the Scott versus Sandford case is the 1850s. Then you have the Civil War. After the Civil War, you have large numbers of immigrants that start to come in, first from Europe, from Germany, France, Sweden, Ireland, right? You start to have immigrants coming from those areas, and those people were not considered to be citizens. It took them some time to argue for their position, and they had to work in very low-wage economic positions, were often, treated unfairly, discriminated against. And then you see the same thing happen again when a large number of Chinese folks start to immigrate in the 1860s, and then they're banned in the 1890s. But again, it's only the low economic folks. If you're from France, Germany, the Netherlands, Sweden, China, Japan, Indonesia, the Philippines, you can come to the United States during these times, even though there's a ban, as long as you're rich. If you're a doctor, if you're a lawyer, if you're a landowner, if you're a slave trader, then you can come to the United States during this time. But if you're a regular folk like most of us, then you're banned, right? You're not allowed. So you kind of see this happening again. They're letting people come into the country, but they're not getting the status of citizens. They're not getting the rights that are in the Constitution. And you see the argument here that Samuel Huntington is making is saying, like, look, to define themselves, people need an other. Now, I disagree with that, but this is a prominent majority view. And he's arguing that the origins of the United States Constitution are Anglo, which is English, and that they're Protestant, meaning anti-Catholic. And that, this society has had a influence over culture, what values, like if you start thinking about individual responsibility, if you start thinking about certain ways of making money, if you start thinking about the institutions like the courts, the Congress, right, the political institutions, and then the historical development of economics, and then the identity of America, down to like, as famously in the NFL protests, down to the Star Spangled Banner. It's very much exclusionary, and it's very much talking about this group of wealthy English elites. So he argues very clearly, and this is very much true. It's just become much more evident today. Throughout history, Americans have not held favorable views of immigrants and did not see the country as a nation of immigrants. They saw it as which you'll find out in other classes, they saw it as, the framers of the Constitution saw it as a settler, colonial experience, people who had left the English monarchy of a certain puritanical Protestant point of view, who believed that their culture was better than other cultures. And so they wanted to replicate that here in the Northeast, and then they wanted to spread out. So this is kind of just in contrast, right? This is the exclusion remains, right, for 200 plus years. But the numbers, the demographics are changing dramatically. So now you have people from all over the world that make up nearly, almost 50% of the population. But the people who maintain the power one, the right to control the politics and the economics and the humans, still remains with a very small, wealthy elite. So this even comes into play recently with myself and 6 other colleagues from criminal justice and political science and sociology. We went down to Washington, D.C. to think about how to include more students in this rights process. And so what we agreed to do over the next couple of years, the 6 of us, is to start in our classes talking about rights consciousness, right? What we think one way to make that change, where more people have access to power, is to teach people about, well, what are the rights, who's excluding you from exercising those rights, and what are some examples of folks who have resisted and end up, winning and exercising their rights. So this is power 2, right? And I try to be funny here with with a little pun, but power also and power 2, right? So power 1 is the right to of the state, right, of this group of people to control other people. Well, power 2 is that freedom. It's power to determine your own life, autonomy, and to participate into politics. So I pulled some quotes from our readings to try to pull this out, but I want to start with these pictures first. What you'll see is one person is advocating for human beings who are suffering from environmental disaster and pollution in particular to rebel, to resist being told that there are no solutions, that we have to keep depending on oil and that blah, 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 blah. But rather to take control of our own lives and say, well, what do we want society to be based on? And to save our lives in many instances. Another example here is an individual who had negative experiences and had actually met Ku Klux Klan members who had made, discriminatory comments against him. And what he did is he took that, and resisted that power over him and said, well, you don't have the right to control me. I'm going to self-define. I'm going to be in charge of my own life. And he's been so successful in changing other people's points of view that he's actually, brought human beings into a dialogue in which they said, you know what, you're right. I was actually not defining myself either. I was being defined by this racist ideology. And so you kind of see how this resistance and how this power 2 can actually change how power 1 thinks about things. And then, right back to the same problem. Folks who are in economically distressed areas don't seem to have the same rights as folks who are wealthy. And so, even though time has changed, right, there has been time that has gone on for the last 200 years, people are still being excluded from being able to be in charge of their own lives and participate in the political and economic decisions. And so the resistance is super important, as Patricia Hill Collins says, because it's not the goal, right? The goal is not to say, well, I'm a resistor. The goal is to start this process of self-definition, right? To start to say, I'm not going to be defined by someone who's trying to dominate me or be a master over me. This also goes to the same idea that Thurgood Marshall had, which is like, separate is never equal. So when we are resisting a power of domination, what we're showing is that the system is not just. And so in order to have justice, everyone's going to have to participate and be included. And you can't have it two ways. Lots of people like to argue with that. But if you're discriminating against someone, then the system is not just. And so in order to get to justice, you're going to have to start to develop a shared language. And obviously the shared language cannot be based on having control over other people. So part of this order and freedom balance is really about trying to point out when order goes too far, right? When it gets out of balance and when it's being abusive. And so this is when you see these two kind of quotes to come together. So Ozma is just trying to point out, like, listen, you can say that you believe in rights. You say you believe in justice. You say you believe in equality. You say you believe in freedom. So, prove it, right? Come out and join us. And then this is the same thing that Huntington is saying in land reform. Reform doesn't happen unless people get organized and they actually do something about it. So you can't depend on, the 14th Amendment or a, liberal interpretation of the Constitution to save you, right? You're going to have to enter into some kind of form of political engagement. And then this is what King is really saying. Like, I must say to you, we haven't made a single gain in civil rights without determined legal and nonviolent pressure. So people have to show up. They have to show, big numbers, and then they have to use the legal processes, right, to fight back. So if one group is using the law against another group, then that group needs to use that same law to resist them. And this is the largest point that King has. And then finally, Metcalf showed through her study that since the 60s, the largest actual movement has been the legal sovereignty movement by American Indians across the United States. One that has been largely successful. And so actually we'll use those two examples. On the one hand, you see here the Trump administration revokes the tribe's reservation status in an effort to grab land to push through the Keystone Pipeline gas and oil corporation, mega corporation enterprise. So they want to take their land in order to dig out the resources underneath them. That's not different than what was going on in the 1850s. So here you see again, one group of wealthy people believes that they have the right in the name of order, in the name of economic prosperity for themselves, to which they will extend, right, to allow people to work. I try to remember, Trump said this is the greatest economy that's ever existed until the pandemic. Now suddenly there's nothing that those folks can do for you. So it's very conditional, this privilege that you get for working for people who get to be the citizens, but you're not actually going to get to participate in the political and economic decision making. So you can see why, people want to have a job, right? They want to be able to feel safe, and so they will give up their power, but it's a temporary thing if you're not free. And so this is this struggle. So if you see on the other hand, right, you see American Indians were not dependent on the national healthcare system. They had their own healthcare system, and so they were the first people to test and to start to quarantine and take care of their own people. So you see this real division coming out. When a group is more focused on freedom, they can adapt quicker. You see this in Germany as well with their federal system, where each region gets to make its own decisions, and so they're not reliant on one big order and one big power group. There's more separation, and there's more people who are in charge of different things. And so lots of time people say, well, this is really bad, this is really messy, it takes a long time. Well, in a situation like this, if one group who has all the power over everybody, and for example, and I'll make a bold statement here, I guess, this drug that Donald Trump keeps pushing, if I were a journalist, I would look at, does he own any stock in the company that makes this drug? Does Jared Kushner, does his family, right, do his advisors? I mean, probably. So, he might not be pushing this drug because it's a good drug. He might be pushing it because every time he mentions it, people buy stock in that corporation. The shares value go up. That might not be the case. He might really just think this drug is good, even though all the doctors seem to disagree with him. But, you want to think about when a representative or a political person comes from a certain wealthy position, I think it's common sense to think that they're going to benefit themselves first. And so that's what you're seeing in the power grab. It's about economic advantage for that group of people, versus a group that has managed to resist that. They have control over their own economic resources, and they can deal with situations in a more fluid and a more adaptive way. So that's kind of, the difference between the order and the freedom. Order seems okay until there's a big emergency, and then suddenly you want your freedom. So to put these into definitions, power one is the ability to make rules for others to follow. And so a lot of times that's how people view jurisdiction, the control over other people and resources. And this is that idea that lots of people have, well, you should obey the rules. That's fine, right? I mean, if the rules are benefiting you, then I suppose you should obey the rules. But what if the rules are designed to hurt you and exclude you? It would be pretty silly and anti-life of you to follow those rules. So that takes us to power two, which is the ability to resist those people who make the rules. So you're not really actually resisting the rules per se. You're saying something like, what gives you the right to make a rule that applies to me but doesn't apply to you? In other words, if it's a discriminatory rule, right, it's not a just rule. So if it's saying you get something but I don't get it, then that's not fair. That's not justice. That's not really a equal treatment of the law. And so that's the freedom or the freedom of self to rule oneself. So in your American government textbooks, it probably calls it autonomy, right? And this is a foundational principle of so-called Western, government. And so this is one of those things that you see at the United Nations. You see as people push for democracy, this is what they're talking about, the right for people to determine their own life. Even the basis of the country called Israel, right, is based on this principle of the right to rule oneself. So when I asked this question about a government structure, what I was saying is like, could a government just on a piece of paper like the Constitution or just the existence of politicians really cause or prevent violence between two groups? So no, right? Because power one and part two that's what we're seeing in the government, right? It's that struggle. And so it really depends on the people and which interpretation do they have, one that favors freedom or one that favors order. And this is what, you have to get to this class is understanding that things are more complicated than this. Human beings are not objects. You can't just move them around and they'll do what you say every time. They're agents, and they're agents of change. We are all trying to make changes in our life. And then change also happens to us through pandemics, through earthquakes, through fires, right, through economic change. And so we're always trying to make these decisions. So you can't make it so simple, right? It's the order versus freedom kind of dichotomy is not so great. And this was Metcalfe's main point. So we have to try to figure out how to get beyond that. So if I apply what we've talked about so far to the Constitution and what's going on right now, I'd also add, like I saw a story this morning saying, one of the big problems is the United States Constitution guarantees the right to travel between states. Let that sink in for a second. I mean, we have a constitutional right to be able to go from one state to the other. But that's exactly what the government doesn't want us to do right now, right? Cuomo is saying, don't do that. The president is sometimes saying, don't do that. The doctors who are working for Cuomo and for Donald Trump are saying, don't do that. So you see this problem, right? To maintain order, you have to restrict people's freedom. But people want to be free. And so this is always a delicate and difficult thing to try to manage. So it's not going to be like, let's just lock everybody down. Well, that's a dictatorship, right? On the other hand, let's just trust everybody will do what they're supposed to do. Well, that's also unreasonable. So there's always this kind of like difficulty, and this is one of the concepts of federalism. And this is the problem of federalism as I see it, and so, or one of the many problems, but this is one main problem we're seeing right now. The problem is that, when we reduce something to saying like, here, party zero, this is, a soiree is a big sex party, right? So these rich people were having these private, eyes wide shut kind of strange parties on these like, very private estates. And so the constitutional right of privacy says these folks can do whatever they want, and then they have enough economic privilege, they're rich enough where they can literally do what they want. So if you think of Harvey Weinstein, if you think of that other guy that was raping young girls, the cases are showing that this is what happens when wealthy people can just abuse the law and abuse power whenever they want. The only way to stop them is to resist them, right? And people have to use the law against them. And so the difficulty is in like a situation like this, like these group of people have turned out to be one of the sources of spreading the virus all around, which is kind of common sense if you think about what they were doing at these parties and people had the virus. And they were only thinking about themselves, if you think about it, right? They were thinking, well, I can go to the doctor, I can afford healthcare, it's no big deal. They weren't thinking about how they're passing it on to the folks that have to clean that house, for the folks that have to, landscape the house, for the post office worker, for when they go to the wine store and they're, spending all this money on wine, but they're also spraying their germs around. Well, these rich people don't live in one place, right? They don't live in just one city. They don't live in just one state. And so one of the problems of federalism is that wealth can be distributed across the world, and you can't really hold it into one place. So wealthy people can have influence, outside of New York. They can have influence all over the place. So that's hard to maintain if you're trying to resist that power and trying to, limit the abuse of power. This is something that wasn't really a thing at the time of the framing of the Constitution. If you wanted to travel to France, it would take you weeks, right? Now it takes you hours. And so this really adds a pressure to the Constitution and the interpretation of the Constitution that really, shows that dichotomy between freedom and order is probably outdated, and we need to think of something else. Another issue comes is like how people can kind of churn one group of people against another. So I just told you that, science has shown and medical professionals have shown that this rich area was one of the places that started spreading the virus first. Common sense also tells you that those who had enough money to be able to travel regularly, business folks, whatever, they were spreading the virus very quickly. But you can just start, wealthy people in particular can start spreading a rumor that no, it's homeless people that have been doing this. Homeless people are the ones that are spreading this. And these are the most vulnerable people. These are the people that, right now aren't getting any health care, aren't getting any services unless they're lucky enough to be found or sponsored. And so you see this kind of like freedom order, it kind of breaks down again when you start talking about people who've been excluded from political processes. We're talking about felons. We're talking about all sorts of people who don't get undocumented immigrants, people who don't get to participate. Suddenly, you see, well, not giving rights and not giving freedom is dangerous for everyone. And so you see, people starting getting blamed about things when the true source of many of the problems is being, muddied or making confused. And this is pretty evident in this series of statements by Donald Trump. And again, I just want to point this out because this is the president of the United States. So he says, on the one hand, the states should get their own supplies. And he's said this, dozens of times. Then Jared Kushner last week says the federal strategic supply is not for the states. It is ours. Media people, I want to ask Donald Trump, what does he mean by that? So Donald Trump says that's common sense. Ours means the people. Well, please go back and remember, which people are we talking about, right? Are we talking about the English people? Are we talking about the wealthy? Are we talking about the people who voted for him? Who is he talking about when he says the people? The people is one of those very confusing phrases that people, use differently. So to kind of contrast that, right? When he says ours means the people, but then he says people are going to die, it's a sad thing. He's obviously not talking about the same people. And then when he's asked, about the person who's in charge of this, he says, well, I'd give myself an A+. I'm doing a wonderful job. Wonderful. I'm sure his supporters and his voters agree with him, but I'm sure the people that don't support him and don't vote for him disagree with him. So again, when we start saying the people have rights, or we speak abstractly like this, in a federal constitution like this, at a time like this, it should be evident to you that these things mean different things at different times to different groups of people. And so there is no unifying law. So if I go back to the purpose of the Constitution was to say to form a more perfect union. It was not to make a perfect union or to say that there is already a perfect union. In fact, it was saying, look, there's so much division. There's some people trying to enslave other people. There's some people who believe in freedom. There's some people who believe in dictatorial order. And so the Constitution is trying to balance that by giving explicit powers and then setting up limits of what people are allowed to do in government. And so people who have done research about this, and this is from the University of Washington where I went, generally speaking, the impact of the myth of rights is most usefully looked upon as a complex and continuing dialectic between legal values and political action. In other words, setting up what I say as law is ideal and law as real, right? So we have law as ideal, right? Sure, wouldn't it be nice if everyone followed the 14th Amendment? And I think you should look that amendment up on your own and read it very carefully because it talks a lot about persons, people, and citizens. So there's 3 different sets of groups, and each get rights according to their group. This is different than, say, the First Amendment, which is talking about Congress, then the media, and then the right of the people being the English people, to assemble and to petition their government. So this is complex, and it goes on and on and on in a contrast, what's called a dialectic, opposing points between freedom and order, right? And so you see this difference can only be explained through political action. So it's not enough in America, in a constitutional democracy like this, to have an opinion and to vote. That's not going to be enough. You're going to have to engage in the political process, and that's on top of autonomy, right? The right to run your life the way you see fit, the right to participate in the security of the country, and then the right to participate in the decision makings about economics, about politics, and about kind of how we organize our society. Those are the principles of this myth of rights. So I just wanted to close with 3 different kind of statements. So one sets up, Article 1, Section 9, United States Constitution, sets up slavery. So it allows for the importation of such persons as any of the states now existing shall think proper to admit. It tries to set up a time where it will be prohibited by Congress in 1808, but it never happens. Congress does not prohibit it, as you know. In fact, the 13th Amendment, if you look at it carefully, doesn't actually prohibit slavery. It just says that slavery shall be banned except in the case of imprisonment. And so you also see that slavery is then institutionalized, but within certain groups, meaning some people are still excluded from the right to get citizenship and the right to participate and the right to be given equal treatment. That's also true here. You say also the migration, right? So immigrants are also given less rights. They're given less participation. They're given less economic benefits. And so I know there's somebody out there saying, oh, but they get money from that comes in. Well, there's been study after study after study after study that shows that immigrants actually produce more benefits economically in the United States than get taken out in benefits. So, and that's common sense, of course, right? Because there'd be further limitations on immigration if it was the other way around. And just by the way, also, immigrants have been leaving the United States in record numbers. The largest times of immigration were, like I said, in the 1860s up to the 1900s, and then again during World War II. So you'll see kind of this, how the institutionalization of slavery, of exclusion, of setting up legal classes of people who get different rights, leads to the ideology and the rhetoric and the debates that kind of go on, and how people use this to exclude people, using words and then using just pretty terrible practices if you think about detention centers. But then I'll contrast this to Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion. Almost everybody thinks about the First Amendment and they tell me free speech. And I don't see free speech in this being given to everyone. It says, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. So again, and it says later, for the right of the people to peaceably to assemble. Well, it does not say everyone. It does not say all persons, and look at the 14th Amendment where it says all persons. Similar to like what you see up at the first one where it says such persons. So these legal restrictions are very clear. And in this case, it's Congress shall make no law. So this does not mean the president can't do it. It doesn't mean that the states can't do it. It doesn't mean that the police can't do it. It says Congress shall not do it. So, these, in law, words really matter, and they have legal definitions. And so when people just say the First Amendment is the right to free speech, and they think it applies to them, they're being naive and they're truly mistaken. And so one case you can look up is Gitlow versus New York, in which he thought he had the right to the First Amendment, but the interpretation of saying order was more important than freedom said he did not have that right. And so you kind of see this happen quite a bit, where those in power tend towards order, which is common sense. If you think about it, they want to maintain their power. Whereas people who are trying to resist, they emphasize the freedom side of it. So it's almost as if you need those two things, but we want to try and think, is there a way to balance that better? And is there possibly a third way of doing it? Well, my suggestion would be this. As Woodrow Wilson says in the early 1900s, he later became president and started the League of Nations, which then later turned to the United Nations. He said, whatever the form of colonial institutions, however, their substance and content were thoroughly English. I think one thing is either making sure that all humans in the United States know the history and structure and content of the law, of the institutions like courts, cops, corrections, Congress, and understand that these all come from a very particular English tradition, one that benefits the wealthy and that one that allowed for slavery and continues to allow for slavery, and put that in context, right? And that way that if you have a culture that's different than this point of view, or if your personal convictions and opinions say that you think this is wrong, now you know who you're arguing about and against, and what the content of your argument would be should not be based in English traditions if you're against those things. And so, again, I'm not trying to say that all English people are bad and that, other people are good, right? What I'm trying to say is that the particular group of people who framed and wrote the Constitution and then went on to maintain power for 200 years are from a very particular point of view. So they don't have a broad view of rights being applied to everyone. They have a very particular way of seeing what rights are and who should get them and what you should have to do in order to qualify for them. And so you want to try to keep that in mind. And if there's a reading that you ever want to do outside of this, you should read Plato's Republic. He talks about the slaveholding society being the ideal society. And so you want to think about that. There are certain people who believe that that's the right way of living, and you can be one of those people. But if you're not one of those people, then you need to start thinking more about power too, more about resistance, about self-rule, about autonomy, about what that looks like when people come voluntarily together. And that would probably be better to look at, like I said, Patricia Hill Collins. But if you're looking at framers of the Constitution, it would be George Mason, it would be John Adams, and George Washington didn't write much, but he did have some things to say about this, and then Ben Franklin. These folks were more in tune and more in support of the concept of freedom. And so that's how I want to leave you and just kind of understand this relationship on identity is really you need to form your own identity in relationship to the framers of the Constitution, the values and the culture that they had. And I guess be aware that there are large groups of people, presently a majority in the United States, that do not believe everyone is entitled to rights. And they have a division of people that they think should be excluded and included. And you very may well be in one of those groups that they think should be excluded. And so you need to be armed and prepared with knowledge that tells you about the history, about the structure, and about how you can engage with your rights. And after the midterm, we'll be focusing more on, how rights consciousness leads to action. But right now, you just need to understand the structure, and that's what takes you from identity to agency. So I hope this has been clear. It kind of explains more of the readings, gives you a background, and fills in some of the gaps that you had.